The honourable member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Waiting for the microphones to come on. I have noticed as we've gone through this debate, Mr. Speaker, that we seem to be the only party on this side of the House that's interested in what's going on here, because there's not a heck of a lot of questions or comments from the other side. This is a bill called the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act. And it also, the minister himself suggested that this act also made it possible for legitimate visitors and immigrants to get better treatment out of this bill. And I just want to comment on the fact that this bill may do that in a very tiny way, but it doesn't really do it for the majority of well-meaning and non-criminal persons currently in Canada who want to come to Canada, who are being treated with the slowest process since God made molasses. It is an incredibly slow process. I have the privilege of representing the riding of York South Weston, which has an immigrant population of well over 50%, and of the population of my riding, well over half live in apartment buildings. And that's one of the reasons that my riding is a magnet for refugees. And those refugees are the ones who are having the worst time of this government's new applications to their lives, because those refugees are finding it more and more difficult to become Canadian citizens, to actually reach all of the thresholds that are required, and to sponsor family members once they do become citizens and landed immigrants. The minister suggested that by lessening the rules against spies, that would be one of the ways that it would make it so much easier for persons to come to Canada and to stay to Canada, by saying that only if you spy against Canada or Canada's interests that you will not be considered a spy if you were spying for some other country or in some other country. And reading between the lines, it may be that they're also adding to that industrial spying, though it's hard to tell. So I'm assuming that's going to make it easier for tens of thousands of people that come to Canada, I said tongue-in-cheek, because that's clearly not a big problem. He also suggested that for persons whose temporary resident visa is being turned down because one member of a group doesn't meet the criteria for medical reasons or otherwise, that the whole group is turned down. And I agree that that is an excellent use of this bill, that will actually cause some people to be able to come to Canada who are otherwise turned down. But as I will show you later, there are far many more people being turned down for temporary visas without any reason. And so this is, again, only a small part of the big problem. He also suggested that the public safety minister can offer some relief in some cases. Again, very tiny pieces of the puzzle. The parliamentary secretary made it very clear in his comments that their objectives are to reduce the backlog of problems of people coming to this country. But he referred very specifically to the backlog that affected temporary foreign workers and the backlog that affected permanent skilled workers coming to take jobs that aren't being filled by Canadians. Well, missing from both those objectives are a huge backlog of family reunification. There are tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of cases in a backlog, some of which are going to take as much as 14 years from application to reunification because of the delays in processing, because there just aren't enough people working for the minister to get these things done. We have examples. A woman has sponsored her husband. It's taken an unusual amount of time to be processed. The background check is taking a long time to complete, and they've been repeatedly asked to wait until a security background is completed, which means they've had to file several sets of medicals at their own expense. The application for sponsorship was forwarded in 2008, so 4 years ago. Another individual tried to sponsor his parents starting in 2007. They have now had 3 medicals because they keep expiring, because it's taking so long. Where is the government on trying to figure out how to make these things faster? They're talking about getting criminals out faster, but they're not talking about getting deserving sponsored immigrants into the country faster. Another person has been sponsoring his parents and siblings since 2003. We're now talking 9 years. And they've now gone through 3 medicals, 3rd police clearance, because they keep expiring. In the meanwhile, the father has passed away. So that's what happens when this system takes too long. People die in other countries as a result. A woman is a convention refugee, applied for permanent residence, also included her 11-year-old son in her application. Her son is alone in Nigeria. And they've said, too bad, there's a 24-month wait to process her application. Another individual has been sponsoring their parents and one dependent sister since 2008. And it's still waiting. It's still waiting. And the list goes on and on and on. And this is just but a small sampling that we've heard about in my office. There are hundreds more in my office, and I've only been there since last year, that have run afoul of the system, and we're having to tell them, look, it takes 14 years, it takes 10 years, it takes 9 years. Yes, your parents will die before this application goes through. Then there's a backlog in skilled worker applications that the minister talked about. Yet with a stroke of a pen, the minister has actually gotten rid of hundreds of thousands of applications, of skilled worker applications, and forced them all to apply again. How is that speeding anything in our system? We are talking about speeding the removal of foreign criminals, but we're not doing anything to speed up the process for legitimate people who want to come to this country and provide a skilled, valued service to this country. I have one applicant who has been trying to come to Canada for 5 years. He made the application before the stroke of the pen issue. And at the time he applied, the language requirement was less stringent than it is today. He has studied and worked in the United States. He taught in the United States. So obviously his English is good. But somehow he failed the English test that was given to him out of Cambridge University in England. Now, why are we giving British tests for Canadian English is beyond me. To a person who doesn't speak, who isn't a native-born speaker, it may be difficult. He found it difficult. He missed by 1 point. He's a doctor. We need doctors. He's actually certified to practice in this country. He wants to bring with him his wife, who is also a doctor, and his daughter, who is in med school. And they can't come because he missed by 1 point because the language requirement was no good. So the skilled worker application has its flaws too. Temporary foreign workers. The other side keeps crowing about how many jobs they've created. How many of them are filled by temporary foreign workers? There's over 300,000 jobs currently filled by temporary foreign workers. Now, they're temporary, so that's in the last 2 years. So since the last recession ended, or whenever the economic meltdown happened under the Conservative watch, over 300,000 of those supposed new jobs they've created are actually being filled by temporary foreign workers. And now, with a stroke of the pen, the minister has decided those foreign workers can be paid 15% less than their Canadian counterparts. So it's going to be even more easier for an employer to say, I can't find anybody. Why? Because I'm offering them 15% less than the going rate. And they're not taking it, so I want to hire foreigners. We've got temporary foreign workers flying planes in this country. We don't have a shortage of airline pilots in this country, but we have temporary foreign workers working for some airlines. There's something wrong with this system. And it would appear to be it's part of the Conservatives' economic action plan to drive down wages in this country through the use of temporary foreign workers at 15% reductions, through the use of reductions in EI that force people to take wages at 30% lower rates than they were working before. And by doing all this, the Conservatives can now then say, hey, our economic action plan is working. We're improving Canadians' productivity. We're getting more out of them for less. That's not what Canadians want, Mr. Speaker. Canadians don't want to be working for less money, to have their standard of living eroded by this government. They want real action on the economy, and they don't want it through the use of temporary foreign workers, which the parliamentary secretary referred to as a good thing. We also have a whole bunch of issues with the PRRA system, the pre-removal risk assessment. I have a couple of examples here. We have an individual who is being deported to Spain. His mother is a refugee in Canada who actually has finalized her refugee status, is actually allowed to stay in Canada, but she was born in Peru. He was born in Spain as a result of her being raped. Now he's being deported back to Spain because he wasn't covered by her refugee application. He's 12 years old. He knows nobody in Spain. Spain is the last place he wants to go because it was the source of a lot of pain for his family. What government does this to people? And now the new rules are not entitled to a PRRA, not entitled to a pre-risk removal assessment because we don't want to do that anymore. So these are examples of how the system isn't working, and we're tinkering on the edges with something that might appeal to the conservative base across the way because it has to do with law and order. It might appeal to the baser instincts of some individuals in the conservative base because they can tout it as being law and order. But it's such a small part of the overall problem of immigration in this country that it is difficult to imagine that so much time and effort is being spent on this kind of thing instead of on the real problems that face immigrants in this country, instead of on the real problems that face those that are already here and those that should be here as a result of sponsorship applications. Those delays in the sponsorship applications are costing lives. People are dying in other countries. The minister also mentioned in his speech this afternoon, I guess it was, that he's spending lots more money on immigrant settlement services. He mentioned the figure of $35 million. Well, it sure isn't happening in my riding. My riding has seen cut after cut after cut in immigrant settlement services to the point where some organizations have folded altogether. Now, is that because we have fewer immigrants coming to my riding? Not on your life. There are lots coming to the riding. In fact, there are 2 apartment buildings that are now full of Roma refugees in the last 2 years, so much so the superintendent has had to go out and hire a Hungarian translator because he can't communicate with these people. These people are coming to the riding in great numbers, but the services that they are asking for keep disappearing. We have a 6% cut at Access Alliance, a 4.2% at Costi, which caused a layoff, a 10% cut at the Learning Enrichment Foundation. Medenta lost all of its funding, $400,000, closed up. York Weston Community Services, $800,000, all closed. 12.5 people laid off. Languages that no longer are helped in this riding: Dinka, Nuer, Spanish, Arabic, French, Kishali, Russian, Farsi, Dari, Somali. Northwood Neighborhood Services and York Weston Community Services was urged the previous year to sign a long-term lease. They did. The government said, you're good for it. Sign a 5-year lease. They signed it, then all their budget was cut. $800,000 gone. $378,000 at Northwood Neighborhood Services, which caused the layoff of 5 settlement workers and admin staff. It's 100% of the CIC funds. They get money from other places, so it's only 30% of their overall budget. But again, these things are happening in my riding. For the minister to sit there and bald-facedly tell us that he's spending more on settlement services is just crazy. Community Action Resource Center lost $305,000, which was 40% of their budget. They lost all of the federal funding, but they still have some provincial funding, and they've lost 12 staff. So it's causing layoffs in my riding, which is already a riding with a huge unemployment problem. The Vietnamese Women's Association lost $30,000 in CIC funding. Access Alliance lost $300,000. TDSB Newcomer Services for Youth lost 100% of their funding, and the program was closed. These are, but there's actually lots more, but I'm going to run out of time if I read them all. The point is, Mr. Speaker, that this government is single-mindedly focused on the wrong problem. There is a problem with settlement services in the riding. There is a problem with immigration systems into the riding. There is a problem with the family sponsorship system. And there is a problem, I think, with too many temporary foreign workers being allowed to come into this country and take jobs that would be otherwise filled by Canadians. And so, rather than focus on those problems, we're going to speed up the removal of a handful of criminals. Not even necessarily the right criminals. We have, because of the cuts to the immigrant settlement funding, we now have employers in the riding who are telling us that it is making it difficult for them to employ the skilled immigrants that are coming into the country on skilled worker applications because they don't have the necessary fail-safes and backup mechanisms and training to learn how to live in Canada. Those things aren't there anymore. And so employers are coming to us in my office and saying, this is a problem for us as employers. We can't be as productive. We can't be as efficient because these people are not, they're great, they have great skills to do the jobs, but they're not getting along in Canada because the settlement services just aren't there. And maybe we need some conservatives to actually listen to some of these employers, because those conservatives maybe should listen to the fact that cutting these settlement services was not a good thing. Cutting the settlement services also makes it difficult for the children of these recent immigrants. And I'm going to get to that next. I have a huge Somali community in my riding, again, because my riding is a place where it's easy for refugees to come because the rents are so cheap, because the riding is full of low-income housing. Those Somali refugees have been here for maybe as long as 20 years. It's been 42 years. They just had an election this month. It's been 42 years since they had an election in Somalia, and they've just elected a new president. There was a big party celebrating that because they're hopeful that maybe Somalia will turn itself around. But the problem is, and we have the tragedy of 6 Somali youth this summer were tragically murdered in what we can only assume was some kind of gangland problem. But it raises the specter of what happens to those disaffected Somali youth when their settlement services are gone, when they have no hope, no jobs, no help from this government, when the services that even the Ministry of Public Safety have cut. And there's been cuts, and these kids have no hope. So some of them turn to crime. Now, what's going to happen to those kids who get a 6-month or more sentence and they're 18 years old and they've been in Canada 17 of those 18 years, but they're still a Somali? They're going to get deported to a country that is war-torn, to a country that is that has no government, really, that is unsafe for those individuals and where they have no family. And that's just wrong. I said earlier that the wrong people, perhaps, are going to be deported. And I will point to those Somali youth who are, one bad occurrence, they're going to have a record, they're going to have a problem, but now they're going to have a bigger problem. If the sentence was 6 months or more, they're going to get kicked out of the country without their family. So what do we do? And yet, I said to the minister earlier, Conrad Black's still here. And apparently, although the crime that he committed in the U.S. could have been punished by a 14-year sentence here in Canada, he is still here. It tells you that there seems to be a double standard. There seems to be a system that if you're just stealing money from ordinary Canadians through some kind of fraudulent system that you're running, that's okay, you can come back. I also want to comment, because Todd Bayless Boulevard is in my riding and was named after Todd Bayless was killed, and we in the NDP will do anything we can to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen again, where a criminal is left in this country long enough to be able to commit crimes of violent nature. We are not opposed to that part of this bill, nor would we ever be. But we want to make sure that it's done in a way that is fair, that is honest, and that doesn't rest so much power in the hands of one or two ministers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, as the government, through Bill C-43, tries to give the impression to Canadians as a whole that we have all these foreign criminals and that issue has to be dealt with, there's a great deal of concern that maybe we need to look at also the other side when he talks about the issue of priorities. There's individuals that are immigrants that are in fact exploited through immigration consultants, employment agencies, and we don't necessarily hear the same sorts of actions trying to deal with that. In fact, over the last weekend, I had the unfortunate individual that I had to meet with, and she was a live-in caregiver. And in her situation, she is a victim from an employer who has been sexually abusing his authority or using his authority in order to sexually exploit. And there's this fear factor of, well, how does that impact me as a landed or someone that ultimately wants to be able to land here in Canada? That there is indeed a good deal of other areas of concern that we should be talking about inside the House of Commons that negatively impacts those individuals that are in fact being exploited, and that priority just doesn't seem to be there for the government. I wonder if he might want to provide comments, given he was talking about the.
The honourable member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the nature of that comment. You're absolutely right, and I believe recently there has been serious criticism leveled at the government over the abuse of particularly temporary foreign workers that is possible. Their living conditions, their standards can be abusive, and we in this country should not abide any system whereby anybody in this country is exploited, abused, or treated ill by their employer or by anybody else. That is just as much a crime as allowing a criminal to stay here. That we should be focusing on all of the systemic problems with our immigration system, not just the ones that score cheap points with a conservative base. That's what we should be looking at. We should be doing this completely, not just in bits and pieces that are aimed at calling it law and order.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Davenport.
Speaker, I'd like to commend my honourable colleague for his intervention today. He knows very well the real-life ramifications of the wrong-headed direction of this government as it pertains to immigrants, as it pertains to new Canadians, as it pertains to refugees. And really, one of our concerns here, I mean, we have on our side declared frequently and openly that in the cases of violent crimes, we certainly want to make sure that those non-Canadians who commit those receive the heavy hand of the law. But what we're concerned about, Mr. Speaker, here is that you've got families, immigrant families, new Canadians who have grave concern over this government's ability to understand the complexity and the nuance of the reality which is Canada today. And this piece of legislation does not give them any kind of confidence that the government can understand that the world is much more complex than the Pleasantville faux reality that they seem to live in every single day. So I'd like to ask my honourable colleague if he could just expand a little bit more on the family dimension, the human dimension of some of these misguided policies of the government.
The honourable member for York South Weston.
The family dimension is by far the the most compelling part of what I see firsthand. Generally speaking, when an immigrant with a problem comes into my office, they come in with 2 or 3 children, with a story that will break your heart. And there isn't, they come for a sympathetic ear, but they also are looking for me to take that sympathy and turn it into action on the part of the government. And all too often, that's not possible. Probably 90%, 95, 99% of the time, these are tragic stories of people who, in many cases, for no reason whatsoever, have run afoul of a system that isn't working, that is broken. I'll give you an example. A woman who took a maternity leave and was sponsoring her husband to come from another country. She had a really good job, and she took a maternity leave. She then was in a car accident a month later. Well, because she'd taken the maternity leave and used up her EI, she was no longer qualified for EI. Her employer kept her job for her, but she didn't have enough money to eat, and she and her baby needed to eat, so she went to the welfare office. The welfare office then told immigration. Immigration said, you're no longer qualified to sponsor your husband. That's the kind of loophole caused by EI, immigration problems, and being in a catch-22 that comes to my office all the time. And these are the kinds of problems that we should be looking at fixing. I agree that we should make it possible for the government. I always thought they already did have the ability to remove foreign criminals. If they're telling us that there's a lengthy appeal process they shouldn't have rights to if they're violent criminals, maybe you're right. But that's not exactly what this bill says. And I think we need to expand the scope of what we do and look at all the problems that face us in the immigration world.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is to the Honourable Member to the opposite. We've talked about the sentencing of criminals that's lessened from 2 years to 6 months, but it's based on the fact that that would be a dual procedure offence. And some of the dual procedure offences that are in the criminal code include sexual assault, sexual exploitation, fraud, and robbery. That is based on whether the Crown and or the defence want to proceed by indictment or dual. So if we go by dual and go down to a summary conviction in 6 months, it doesn't lessen the fact that the act is just as serious as would be under indictment. So would he agree that even though a person may be convicted of sex assault and only get a 6-month sentence, that they aren't deserving of this type of application through this bill?
The Honourable Member for York South-Weston.
It's a mug's game to try and second guess which 6-month crimes and under which circumstances we should be deciding to deport individuals. That's essentially what we're doing. We're kicking them out of the country. And the example you gave may very well be an example of an individual who should not have the right of appeal, who should be, in fact, told, okay, once your 6-month sentence is up, you're being deported. Here's the plane ticket. Although they don't give away plane tickets anymore. They make you buy it yourself. Here's the plane ticket, and you're out of the country. It's difficult for me to start to guess which crimes that which people have committed that are capable of being used by this legislation. The example was given earlier of a person who happens to grow 6 pot plants. And I know of such an individual who grows them for his mother with multiple sclerosis. And it's not trafficking because he's giving them away, but he happens to grow 6. Luckily, he hasn't been caught. If he'd been caught, it's a minimum 6-month sentence. And with a minimum 6-month sentence, that person, if he was not from Canada, would be deported automatically for trying to do good. That's the kind of nuance that's missing from this bill. It's, as was described by my colleague from Newton North Delta, it's hitting a fly with a sledgehammer. These are very, very few individuals that are trouble to the system, and yet we are using an enormous bill to try and get at them.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire? The Honourable Member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would thank my friend from York South-Weston for his presentation. I think all of us as members of Parliament can tell you many heartbreaking stories of what's going on in the immigration system. But I wanted to ask him a specific question on C-43. I asked one of his colleagues about the lack of ministerial discretion to make an exception for compassionate grounds. It's limited only to where a child is directly affected. But there's sweeping discretion that's quite mind-boggling at Clause 8 that says the minister may, on his own initiative, declare that a foreign national may not become a temporary resident if the minister is of the opinion that it is justified by public policy considerations. Public policy considerations isn't defined. Does this level of wide discretion, not your speech, of course, spoke to deporting people. What about refusing to allow someone to become a permanent resident with no real criteria being applied?
The honourable member for York Southwest, and you only have 30 seconds.
I have to agree with you that in cases such, I agree with the member from Sandwich Gulf Islands that the discretion in that circumstance is very strangely put. Without any guidelines, without any indication of exactly what is a public policy consideration, one could imagine a number, certainly in a third world country, you could imagine a gazillion different things that would be public policy considerations that would keep people from becoming Canadian citizens. We aren't a third world country, but the same problem exists in that there is no definition, there is no direction, there is no example given of what is a public policy consideration. It's a very scary prospect.